In this episode, we're talking with Simon Pressley from Propertyology, and we're going to explore what really drives property markets in this country. Population growth? Is it supply? Is it incomes? Or is this all a load of BS? We'll also look at the potential impact that AI and increased access to property data might have on investor behaviour. Do we have a new market driver we now need to consider?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
Hi, I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, currently ranked number 3 in the MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, everything we talk about today is not personal advice, and we recommend you engage the services of a licensed and experienced professional.
Our guest today is Simon Pressley, Propertyology Head of Research and Managing Director. Simon has carved out a career as a professional property investor and full-time analyst of the fundamentals of the property markets in every capital city and regional location throughout Australia. That's a big job. And as a result, he's developed an intimate understanding of the complexities of property markets, the machinations of the numerous inputs, and the knock-on effect that human actions have on property markets, which of course we love to talk about here. Now, thank you so much for joining us today, Simon. We're looking forward to an illuminating discussion.
Thank you both for having me on.
Simon, it's going to be a good chat. I mean, the regional investing story and the work you've done, it's something that's very topical. But before we sort of go into detail there, we always like a bit of myth busting. I mean, you've been in this for a long time. You've studied markets in great detail. I mean, what are some of the big property myths in your mind that we should debunk?
A lot of them are things that make sense logically. And back in the day, I was as guilty as everybody else, Chris, and sort of thought that makes sense. That must be true. So, the biggest myth is that population growth is what has the biggest force on property prices. It's actually false, but lots of people believe it. Or capital city has something to do with capital growth. Region has something to do with risk. Water makes real estate grow. Sea change is better than tree change. Warm climates are more popular than cool climates. They're very emotive things. And I think because people live in property, Chris, often they're projecting themselves. So they're sort of thinking about, well, I can't imagine why someone would want to live in a location that's got 20,000 people or the weather's not very warm or something like that. So why would anyone else do it? And why the hell will they grow? What I realised, I sort of stumbled across about 10, 15 years ago, not a single human being has ever studied Australian real estate history. So that's why there's so many myths that something sounds logical, like the population growth story. Someone says it, especially if they're an economist or someone that's got some status. No one questions it because it makes sense. And then you've got something that's just been adopted for generations and generations that's actually bullshit. But no one knows it's bullshit, right? So, there's lots of myths.
We totally agree that there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of, what seems on the surface of it logical, but actually when you scratch just a little bit, you realize it's not. And I think a classic example of population growth and price growth not necessarily correlating is Sydney through COVID. We had the biggest migration out of the joint, and yet we had this huge price rises. So obviously there's other things going on, but you do say you're the only person that's researched the history of Australian property. I actually will have to disagree with you on that because I know that there's been others. Cameron Murray, like the economist Cameron Murray, has written a great book called The Great Housing Hijack, and that sort of goes back and he gives examples of some governor arriving in Australia back in the 1800s, hearing people complain about housing shortages. So he says very similar things to you that, none of this is new. We've heard it all before, it's, so I'm going to just pull you up on that. But I totally agree with you that most people sort of skim the surface, they read the headlines and then they just think they know enough, right? So do you believe that the same factors, however, if we look at the key factors that do drive property markets across the country, is it the same factors that drive all markets just in varying degrees, or is it just, okay. So do you want to, I guess, tell us a bit about the mix and what those factors are?
So where people think, demand is population growth, logically that makes sense, and they think supply is construction. They are both part of the supply and demand equation, but they're very, very small part of it. At its absolute core, as complicated as property markets are, in its most simplistic form, Veronica, it's a relationship between the volume of buyers and the volume of property for sale. So it's supply building a whole heap of new homes. The evidence confirms every single year in every location in Australia, 95% of the properties that are purchased are not new, they're established. And yet, if yourselves and anyone listening to this, if you think about your own journey through life and how many times you bought a property, whether to live in yourself or an investment property, some people would have bought a brand new home. Most people would have said, oh, I've never bought a brand new home, right? So it's a relationship between how many properties are available to purchase. We can't purchase it if it's not available, right? You can't knock on the owner's door and say, piss off, I want that. If it's not for sale, there is no what we call resale supply. So on the supply side of things, what's most important is not the new construction stuff. It's how many stock is the term that the property profession refers to, right? How many properties are listed on the market in City X today? And is that volume higher than normal, lower than normal, or normal? Buyer activity, again, where people think it's all about population growth, if population is growing, we need more homes, so therefore prices have got to go up. Well, hang on a minute. Anything that humans pay money for, you need more of if there's more population growth. We need more doctors, we need more teachers, we need more trains, we need more food, we need more fashion. But if it was true that population growth forces property prices up, the evidence would prove that it's true, but would also prove the same that everything else that humans pay money for. And that's not the case, whether it's COVID or anything at all. We buy property at different stages of our life for different reasons. The demand for property or for anything else, demand does not exist if there's a buyer who doesn't want something. So if you think of the stereotypical, couple in their young 30s who is currently renting and they've saved their pennies and they become a first home buyer, they are now triggering demand. They have created an extra bit of competition in the market, but they haven't influenced the population figure. If you then picture that same couple 10 years later and they got a couple of kids, the first home is no longer big enough, so they want to upgrade to something bigger. When they do that, again, they're competing, but so they're creating more pressure in the market, but there's no change in population figures.
Except for their 2 kids they had.
Correct, yes. But what are they? Babies don't buy anything, right?
No.
Babies need a cot, right? So the population, and that's a great scenario. Thank you, Veronica. Then the population data there, it would say population's grown by 2. So the simple-minded human will go, well, we need 2 more homes.
Yeah.
Right? So that young couple, another 10 years on, they want a nicer home. In the late 40s, early 50s, income's a lot higher, got equity, they want to upgrade again. Each and every time someone buys property to live in or as an investor, you are creating competition. So that relationship is the same whether we're talking a population of 5,000 people, a tiny little regional town, or a big capital city or anywhere in between. What influences buyer behaviour the most is the economic conditions of the individual town or city. So whether it's Albo or Peter Dutton or whatever talking about the national economy, there's no such thing as the national property index. And this is why every single year when we look at what happened in the last 12 months of all the locations across Australia, you'll have some locations that had double-digit growth. You'll have some that had 2%. You'll have some that had no growth, and they have some that lost 10%. Their individual towns and cities will have very different economic conditions, which directly influences the buyer confidence and the broader, strength of household incomes. So it's always about that.
I think you've touched on some really good points there. The turnover rate and the amount of properties on the market, that's really the available listings, right? And people often forget about that. Is they and if that's increasing every year, and as less people are living in their homes longer, they're living longer, they're turning over properties less because they can't afford to upgrade, then the amount of stock on the market or the supply of property is reducing. And I think you hit the other major point that I think a lot of people miss is that internally, though, a city can be growing, the population can be stable, right? But is it also not true that a town that's got population growth or strong population growth can obviously grow a lot faster because you're increasing demand a lot more, that people are new to the city or town and they need a lot of property. So population growth is needed really for long-term sustainable growth, do you say? Or do you think that...
No. There are plenty of situations, different towns and cities in different periods when property price growth and population growth have occurred at the same time. But conversely, there are also lots of other situations where there's been, Veronica gave the most obvious example with COVID, where there's been no population growth, but not just some capital growth, significant capital growth. And believe it or not, there's also a bunch of other locations that have had populations decline and still had strength in property markets. So if it was true that population growth was a really dominant force for price growth, then there would be compelling evidence for that. So when it's always about economic growth, so that's the common denominator, whether it's a capital city or region, no matter how big or small. If it's a weak economy, you'll have a weak property market. If you go back to the relationship I was describing earlier, Chris, between buyers and sellers, if you've got a weak economy, there'll be some people who've got confidence in their own job, but there'll be less people than normal who've got confidence in their job, even though they themselves might be, I'm fine, but my brother just lost his job and my they're giving out redundancies at his work. So you might be fine, but you're going, yeah, I'm not quite sure it's a good time. So you won't transact to invest or upgrade or whatever.
You was one of the first, I would say, out there just tracking buyers agents and investment specialist buyers agents out there, right? There was a lot that the consensus coming into the last 5 years that capital cities outgrew sort of regions. There's been an explosion of regional buyers agents in the last few years, which we won't go there yet. We can talk about that later. But why were you so confident on the regions when a lot of other buyers agents around the country were focusing on capital cities? And do you think that it's sustainable in terms of the fundamentals of what driven prices over the last 5 years? COVID and higher rates, etc. Do you think that that's the sustainable long term?
To me, now and always, Chris, region and capital are just terms. If we think it's like a share investor saying, I don't know, tech stocks versus banking stocks, they're just terms, right? You can have some good technology companies and some shit ones. And it's the same with capital cities and in regions. Now and always, the very best performed property markets every single year have been among the regions. But that doesn't mean all regions have done well. And no region, the same as no capital city, always does well. But statistically, mathematically, it makes sense. There are only 8 capital cities and there are more than 400 regions, right? So, forget in each individual capital city or region, that is just a term. But if you're saying, look, what are the odds in the year 2025 or the year 2045? What are the odds? Is the best performed location going to be a capital city or a region? The odds are pretty bloody compelling, right? There are about 300 regions that we would never touch. So I've never been sort of pro-region or anti-capital city. I've invested in both because they're just terms. But it's understanding, that relationship we were talking earlier between buyers and sellers. What are the conditions now? And what most importantly, because you're not buying property for a day, so what are the inputs that have happened in, say, the last, 1 or 2 years that might not have materialized yet, but there's been a policy here and there's been a decision there and there's a suggestion of this. So when those things materialize, how are those things likely to influence buyer activity, number of stock on market in the future? That's really what, forecasting is about. You are predicting, not an exact science, but you are predicting the impact on buyer and seller behavior based on big picture policy decisions and different industry drivers. So regions have always done well. Capital cities have always done well. But no individual location does well every single year, do they?
No, they don't. And I guess what you sort of saying, you've got 8 capitals, and I guess that's sort of a bit unfair even because you've got some regional centres, like you got Newcastle and Townsville and
they're big. They're really
Geelong,
big.
They're bigger than Hobart, so therefore, we probably need to, I think, 12 large city or Darwin, we've got 12 large cities. Would you say, let's say 12. So of the 12, your proportionate, like your odds of choosing a good one is sort of, I don't know, what's the comparison between if you actually looked at the percentage of, long-term performers in terms of capital city versus those long-term performers that you're talking about in regionals? Would you say that the risk is the same?
This is a great question. Not many people understand. So the earlier point about size of cities and that sort of stuff, you're right. There are some really big regions. We literally have 25 in total individual towns or cities that have a population of 100,000 or more. So officially, the 25th biggest city in Australia is the border town of Albury-Wodonga. Right. But you've got the names you mentioned earlier: Geelong, Wollongong, Newcastle, Townsville, Ballarat and Bendigo are in there. So we've got a lot, right? But what we also know is that population size has no bearing whatsoever on risk. And that surprised me, right? So back in the day, I was as guilty as everybody else. It's all about population growth. And also, if it's too small, it makes it risky. Well, that's the perception. That when you study the evidence, if the perception was true, there would be evidence to say, well, yeah, that is true because in these years, have a lot of that crash. So what actually defines risk doesn't matter whether it's got 20,000 population or 20 million. The single biggest influence on risk or the potential for a market to lose a lot of value is economic diversity. Perhaps the best example to talk about there and to highlight it is the city of Perth. So fourth biggest city in a country that's got 400 individual townships. If the three of us, joined forces and bought the median house in Perth in the year 2006, we would have paid $480,000. If we still own that median house 14 long years later, in the year 2020, it's still worth $480,000. But it's a big capital city and it's got a wonderful lifestyle and it's coastal and ticks all those boxes that are completely useless boxes. It ticks another completely useless box. That 14-year period, Perth had the highest population growth in all of Australia. And the median house price hasn't moved. So it's not about big. Officially, the most expensive in terms of median house price, the most expensive city in all of Australia has a population of 37,000 people. A place called Byron. The second most expensive location is a population of 23,000 people. A place called Kiama. Another place called Bowral has 10,000 people. That's it. And it's our fifth highest city. It's more expensive than 7 capital cities. So it's not about size.
No, but there's a lot in this, right? There's volatility.
There is.
Like Byron is an extremely volatile market, for example. There's also, when you've got more population, more dwellings, then you've got a bigger data set. So you even just you're working with that data is a bit more reliable, statistically more reliable, your analysis and assessments, So therefore, it's pretty reliable for those 14 years. Not many people were investing in Perth, But the point I'm trying to make there is just when you try to use data to make decisions, when you've got bigger data sets, it's a lot easier, right? So how do you go about trying to look at those areas with a lot of diversity of stock as well? Even a diversity of the type of person that lives there, incomes, the spread of incomes in Byron is huge. That actually makes it a lot more difficult to read as a researcher, right?
Yeah. So one thing we'll agree there, Veronica, is in data there needs to be a big enough critical mass of transactions for data to be reliable. So, for example, when people are talking, let's say median house price changes, last month in suburb X, complete waste of time. Complete waste of time, right? Because there might have been 10 properties that changed 10 or 100 properties. Complete waste of time. But you're looking at those numbers and it says, median house price, in suburb X grew by 50% last year. Wow, let me buy there. It's got gold dust sprinkled all over those properties. No, it might have grown by 10%. You don't know. It just had a very small number of transactions. So, but when it comes to other data sets, all data, we just need to be confident that is the data reliable? Is there a big enough volume of transactions for us to consider this data to be useful? And certainly, whether a location's got 37,000 people like Byron or 20,000 people or 10,000 people, there's significantly there's more than enough data available for most statistics. Certainly not saying all to say this is a reliable metric to fact. And there's no one metric. It's the combined sum of literally dozens. But to sort of say, Sydney and Melbourne are big and they got 5 million people, therefore its data's more reliable than somewhere else that's got 100,000 or 30,000. No, that's not true.
Simon, when you're looking at, say, like a regional location, right? Let's say, you decide that this is the area you want to focus on.
Yeah.
Within that town, let's say it is regional. And what's your sort of property philosophy when you're looking at that? And let's say you've got budgets, you can pick, buy whatever you wanted in that. You go from the top end to the bottom end. The buyer's got the budget, whatever you need, right?
Yeah.
Do you go for where there's a real lack of supply in terms of, close to the main street, a nicer block, a heritage frontage, where all the affluent, aspiring people doing well within that town want to live, or maybe the acreage on the fringe that, is quite scarce because they're very hard to buy? Or do you sort of go, well, where in the market do most buyers in that, region want to buy, and where is there, at least more affordable property, say, for example, we're not buying more on the higher end. Like, how do you, and is it a buy and sell strategy? Like, is it a getting in, capturing the growth, selling when, there's a bit of a boom, and then retrading and buying into another market? Or is it like, let's say it's a 30, 40-year-old couple and they can hold this thing forever. There's no pressure. It's just going to be it could go into the bottom drawer and be a buy and hold forever.
Yeah.
Do you play that strategy, or do you sort of buy and sell? Like, what's your philosophy?
Yeah, great, Chris. So probably two questions in there. So first relates to the asset selection. So we're imagining we've been borderless and looked at all the locations in Australia and we've said that city there, we want to buy there. Now what property did we find? One of the beautiful things about real estate is you can make the worst decision in the world, and if you hold it for 20 years, like, you're still going to be really, really happy. Again, the evidence confirms, seriously, we could be the biggest fall out of 27 million Australians and buy the oldest, ugliest house on the busiest road in Australia. And that house today would be worth, roughly 3 times what it was worth, say, 20 years ago. So that's something people can take comfort with. But does that mean it was a good decision? Well, no, because you could have made a lot better decision than that, right? So there is no... The great question about the asset selection philosophy there, Chris, like, there is no right or wrong. I'm a big advocate of, so we only work with investors, and so we see property as a financial instrument. We're not buying our home, so it's important that we remove ourselves from, well, what would I want to live in if I moved there? That's a natural thought process that a lot of investors have, but you need to remove that to give yourself the best chance of making the best decision for you. I believe in that. The most sensible financial statement ever made is don't place too many eggs in one basket, right? Because if you trip over, you break all the eggs, you've got nothing left. But if you spread your eggs across multiple baskets, you can still make an omelette if you fall over. So think of property like that. It's a financial decision if you're an investor. If someone's got $1 million, every location in Australia, including Sydney, we could buy a property for $1 million. But is that a really good decision? Is really what it comes down to. So a hypothetical location where the meat and potatoes property might cost 700 grand, we're going to be focusing on buying a structurally sound, low maintenance property worth roughly 700 grand, even if our client says, I'll get $1 million. Can you buy something that's more luxury for me? The luxury thing will grow. The meat and potatoes one will grow as well. But you'd be better off setting that 300 grand aside or putting it towards the next meat and potatoes property in a completely different part of Australia. And spreading your eggs further rather than putting it all in that one asset. Because no one, can say what's going to happen in location X in 3, 4, 5 years' time. So you stick all that $1 million into that one property, and then you have your flat patch that every location will have at some point in time, and you're stagnating, your portfolio is stagnating. But if you resisted that urge and said, well, a meat and potatoes property here is 700 grand, that 300 grand is not enough to invest yet, but I'm well on the way. Maybe in 1 or 2 years' time, I might have enough to buy the second property then. So that's what I would do. The other benefit there is not only you're spreading your eggs, but your cash flow is much better. If you bought that $1 million property compared to the $700,000 property, you've got a mortgage servicing $1 million asset compared to servicing a $700,000 asset. So you can be talking $15,000 a year cash flow shortfall compared to 35. Quite, a big difference, right? So that's my answer in regards to asset selection. The second question related to strategy. Some things I believe there are similarities to making good decisions to what a share investor would do in the stock market. But there are some things that it just doesn't work because it is a different asset class, isn't it, right? Economics is what has the biggest influence on property markets and share markets. So that there's a similarity there, but you can buy a share for $1. You can't buy a property for $1. So the great question, Chris, about, is the philosophy buy, try to have the crystal ball and pick when you've reached the top of the market, sell, turn your equity into cash, redeploy that somewhere else, look for the next right. No, I wouldn't encourage anyone does that. The transaction costs screw the property investor. The share investor doesn't have them. So, the typical property, stamp duty might be, depends which state you're buying in, but somewhere between 40 and 50 grand. The disposal costs, the agent fees when you sell it, again, depends on the value of the property, but could be easily 30, 40 grand. So just to take your capital out of market A when you sort of think it hit the top, and then put that same amount of capital into market B, you've ripped up 100 grand. And that might take, who knows, might take 4 years to get that growth.
Plus, you have to pay tax on any gain you've made, so it's actually less capital that you're putting back in. But it's interesting, though, because when you're trying to sort of predict a market that's going to take off, I mean, is that what you do? Are you sort of focusing on, okay, like the hot spotting idea? You're focusing on...
No, we're not a hot spotter.
Right, okay.
Not a hot spotter.
So therefore, when you choose a market, you're actually not trying to predict it so much as trying to look for a market that has fundamentals for long-term growth. Is that what you're saying?
Well, fundamentals is a good word. We anticipate that every location, not just the last 20 years, but 20 years before that, 20 years before that, 20 years before that, property markets, capital cities and regions have grown by no less than threefold over a 20-year period of time. So I guess but that doesn't mean it will do it in the next 20 years, but you got 8 chunks of 20-year periods that every property investor can sort of take a lot of comfort out of investing in Australian real estate. This is why it's so popular, right? But there's got to be a reason why someone picks location A over location B. Hopefully they're a lot more intelligent than saying, and I'll criticize myself here, my first investment property, where do you think I bought it? In my own hometown, right? It's called a confirmation bias. It's, you're barracking.
Home bias.
Yeah, it is, but it's not intelligent, right? But 20 years
for some
later,
people, it's a good start. For some people, depending on where they live, of course. But for some people, it's a good start. The thing is,
it's better than not investing at all, Veronica. Definitely, yeah.
And the thing also is that not everyone has the opportunity to buy a second property. Like if they've got $1 million now, they might not ever have another 700. It's sort of, I guess the decision has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, because I mean the fact is it's still 71% of investors only have one property, right?
Yeah.
Or are you saying if those people were your clients, they'd have more than one? Is that what you're saying?
No, some do, some don't. No, I mean everyone, you learn many things over your journey, don't you? And one thing is that motivation comes from within. It's got nothing to do with how many university degrees has someone got or what is their income or whatever. Some people are naturally motivated to, one day, well, I want to exit the workforce and I want to have a better lifestyle, the modern age pension and a bit of superannuation gives, That's got nothing to do with occupation or qualifications. That's an attitude. So there are people, our clients, your clients, others who got 3 or 4 properties and they're 35 years of age, and they're earning 100 grand each, but they're really, really motivated. We've got others who are doctors and surgeons that are earning $600,000-$700,000 a year, and they bought their first investment decision was at age 53. You just think, oh, what a waste. I'm sure you've had a good time 53 years of your life, but when you get sick and you can't work in 5 years' time, and that income's gone, what do you got to show for it?
Simon, I think you're absolutely. I mean, I guess with the buy and hold strategy, it makes sense, right? The cost to buy, the cost to sell, the transaction costs, etc. And so, is there a time though where you've sort of had to advise clients to get out of a region where you thought, because I really like your point around the economic stability and the confidence in that, and multifaceted. So you wouldn't go to mining towns, etc. You go to a region or a town that's got multifaceted sort of employment, but is there a regional town that looks good in paper, in 2010, and then by the time 2015 came around, it's like, hang on a sec, it's really struggling, and it just makes sense for our clients to reconsider, having them, even though there's transaction costs to get out. It might be better to use that borrowing capacity and equity into other markets, and it goes against our philosophy to sell, but it probably makes sense in this scenario to sell.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we mentioned Perth earlier before. It's why I say it's the best case study out of 400 towns and cities in Australia. It just highlights the importance of economic diversity. But economic diversity has got nothing to do with population size. There are roughly 100 towns and cities in Australia that have incredible economic diversity. There are 300 that don't have enough. Perth, Darwin, and Canberra that are 3 capital cities that they don't have enough economic diversity for our liking. But the importance of economic diversity when you're an investor and you're about to put capital into a market is to acknowledge, I don't have a crystal ball. Conditions look good now, but I don't know, there could be something down the track that there's just no amount of research that could make me alert to that. So it's learning from history what causes really disappointing periods of property markets, big or small cities. What have been the cause? Forget about which locations, what caused it, and then build some resilience in your strategy. So hopefully investors are understanding the importance of economic diversity, and it minimizes the chance of a long period of underperformance. It won't stop it. You can't guarantee it, but it reduces the chances. But it can happen in locations that have incredible economic diversity. Right here, right now, we're having this conversation. Melbourne has incredible economic diversity. Awesome city. I love the city of Melbourne, but I need to park that confirmation bias and comment on Melbourne through the lens of a property market professional. Over the last 7 years, Melbourne's median house price has increased by 3% in 7 years. That's flat, and that's a long period of time. In that same 7 years, Melbourne's population has grown by 500,000 people. So it hasn't been a lack of economic diversity that's caused that, but broadly, Melbourne's economy has struggled for much of that last 7 years, right? So there's a great example. You could be a really big city, you could be a tiny town, but either way, if your economy's going well, your property market will do well. If your economy's going poor, it works in reverse, doesn't it?
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. Most people don't realise that they can cost themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars over the medium to long term when they make property decisions without all of the information that they need. And what I do is help people with tricky real estate problems, which often masquerade as simple questions like, should I sell my investment property because the interest repayments are hurting? Or should I buy before I sell? Or the other way around. You can connect with me and access all of the tools that I've created to help you make better property decisions at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you will find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program. You can connect with my Sydney-based property management and buyer's agency teams, Australia-wide vendor advocacy, or ask me for introduction to the small group of buyer's agents that I would personally recommend across the country. That's veronicamorgan.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and, importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via my website, alcove.com.au.
So we've got some people touting Darwin at the moment as the next hotspot. So what are your thoughts on that?
I can understand why people are thinking about it, and I'm always an admirer of people that have curiosity. The fundamentals for learning and knowledge is curiosity. And with the age of bloody digital technology, we don't have enough curiosity. It's just Google or Siri, tell me this. So I admire the lateral thinking, I suppose, for Darwin. The signs of a significant amount of growth in the near term, this year, next year, are not there, right? But I wouldn't be surprised if, hypothetically, we're having this conversation in 2 years' time, and I'm saying in the last 12 months, they've approved this, they're doing that, there's a proposal for X, and my outlook for Darwin then is a lot different to what it is now. We still wouldn't invest there because it doesn't have that economic diversity piece. It has some economic diversity, but heavily reliant, Veronica, on gas. Darwin had a 10-year period up to the year 2013 where 8 out of those 10 years was double-digit growth. I mean, no location in Australia has ever done that, big or small city. But it was all driven by enormous gas projects. And once the gas projects are finished, all that local buyer confidence, local buyer competition diminished.
Probably population too.
Some did, yes. So some people moved to Darwin for the big employment job, the 300 grand salary or whatever. But they know as soon as that contract finishes, I'm going to be out there. But the median house price, so I said that's what happened in 10 years to 2013, right? Now fast forward, there's been 12 years since then. How can Darwin is worth the same today as 12 years ago? So it's got nothing to do with capital city. It's lack of economic diversity.
What about Hobart though? Because Hobart, went gangbusters the end of last decade, and now it's definitely on the other side of that roller coaster. What sort of economic diversity is in a place like Hobart?
The economic diversity of Hobart is, just as good as Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, some other regions. Hobart, if we look at the last 20 years, according to the official statistics, it's been the highest average annual capital growth rate over the last 20 years. But Hobart's also no different to any other location. It hasn't boomed every year. It's had some years where it's been disappointing. It's had some years like the last 2 years where it's gone flat. Really no different to Sydney, Melbourne, Timbuktu. In terms of the official economic...
But it is different. It's a much different city than Sydney or Melbourne. I mean, you don't have the knowledge centre there. You don't have industry there in in the same way. Like, I'm truly curious. I don't know what the diversity is in Hobart. I love Hobart as a place. I mean, it's a great place, but it certainly went gangbusters. But you're talking about this diversity, but I'm not sure what underpins the economy there.
Yeah. So Hobart is a very different city to Melbourne and Sydney. I would agree with that. I could name 200 other locations and say they're very different to Sydney and Melbourne. In fact, probably Sydney and Melbourne are different to all of the other 400 locations in Australia. So they're probably odd one out, right? But specific to Hobart's economic profile, health and education and retail make up the biggest portion of their workforce, right? So that's atypical of a capital city anywhere around the world. In terms of its points of difference, so every city's sort of got its points of difference or assets. So think of Sydney, banking and insurance. They're the head offices for those big companies. Hobart, they do have education is a very big driver. They get lots of international students that go there. It's the gateway to the Antarctic, so it is a big knowledge centre. You weren't aware of that, but it is a big knowledge centre. There are a lot of creative minds. Some have always lived in Tasmania. Some have relocated there to develop their creative mind, whether it's in the various sciences or in art or something like that. The whole state of Tasmania, Veronica, is officially the best quality produce.
Yeah, best air, best water, beautiful.
Yeah, on the planet, right? Now, Hobart itself is not where the farms are, but the
not
food...
far.
Exactly, but the food is, right? So now it's not to say that there's, a huge percentage of its workforce working directly in agriculture, no. But there's a significant amount that are working in the manufacturing sector, making wine or making pastry or making various dairy products or whatever. There's a small defence element down there as well. It's a staple part of the workforce. Tourism, it's not a tourism town, but up until probably
Mona.
I was guilty as anyone. I'm 54 and I had never been to Hobart or anywhere in Tassie until 2014. It's always been there, right? But I was good like everyone else, and because most of the comments I'd heard was not complimentary. And then I went there and went, how long has this ticket been kept for, right? And then we travelled around the whole state and thought, the whole place is gorgeous. So it wasn't just me that had that experience, and Mona played a big role in that, a reason to go there. People who like food and booze experiences and wineries and fresh air and getting away from the hustle and bustle. Tassie has been big on major events in the last few years. So if you think of Big Bash cricket in Launceston, if you think of the national basketball team, Tasmania are currently the national champions in both basketball and cricket. And in a couple of years' time, Hobart is going to have a team in the national AFL competition. So all these things have a big, big boost to the visitor economy in the tourism sector. Long answer, but hopefully that for you and your listeners gives a greater appreciation for the economic diversity in Hobart.
So Simon, back to that, Chris, because I did ask you too, and I probably got a habit of doing that after about 7 or 8 years of doing this. I still haven't learned that mistake. But when you sort of went, I wouldn't buy the million over the 700, is there a danger of going for, more properties in terms of, you've got more roofs to fix, you've got more maintenance, you've got, or do you think that that's offset by the rent? And do you think there's a lot of that risk is offset through the due diligence of when you're actually buying these properties and making sure they're structurally sound, etc.? Is it, do you minimize those risks through that? And, but do you also look at it and go, because it makes sense if you think about, you're in Brisbane, and parts of Brisbane have grown at a much faster rate than other parts of Brisbane, right? Look at the boom over the last, 5 years. Sydney, Melbourne, the percentage growth in certain pockets versus other pockets. And you'd have to argue that maybe it's more the inner rings of these cities that have grown at a faster rate over decades. Do you think that applies to these regions? And, while, cash flow might not be as good, is there a benefit of potentially just going for, more expensive assets because growth might be stronger there long term? Do you weigh on, because in my mind, that's how I'd be playing. I just find it hard. Yeah, you get the benefit of diversification and but you got to have more properties, but sometimes less is more, I find.
The fact you're asking the question is great. So what everyone should do before acting on the decision, is to think of all the variables and what are the important things I need to think about, and then step through those to actually be able to answer your question rather than just have a perception and jump in without, checking through the perception. So the fact you asked the question is great. More often than not, when you've got the option of, say, buying one property worth, let's call it $1 million, make it simple for people, versus 2 properties at 500 grand, you will have, if you're the owner of the scenario 1 compared to the owner of scenario 2, you'll have more individual bills to pay if you've got 2 properties. You've got 2 lots of council rates, 2 lots of insurances, etc., right? But if you look at it as a profit loss scenario for both portfolios, the rental income for the $1 million house, and then you take off all the individual expenses, and you end up with a net loss at the end. If it was $1 million, where's that now? Not Parramatta, it's probably $1.4 million. But Melbourne, right? $1 million property in Middle Ring, Melbourne, would be around about $1 million today, right? If you're buying that property today with a 10% deposit, you're probably going to have, before you lodge a tax return, an annual shortfall of about 40 grand with a home loan rate at 6.5%. That's today's numbers, right? But if you bought, say, 2 properties that were combined of the same value, yes, you got more individual bills to pay, but the total of the 2 rental income streams will be significantly more than the one more expensive property. Your mortgages are the same because you borrowed the same amount of money, right? You've got 2 loans, but the total size of the mortgages is the same. So the interest component, which is always every investor's biggest expense, that's the same. So when you look at the combined profit and loss statement of the portfolio that's got those 2 properties that are collectively worth as much as the other, it won't be anywhere near the 40 grand shortfall. On today's dollars, it's probably about 25 grand.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess the rent you've got to pay tax on, right? And then you've got the, potentially 2 roofs to fix, and you've got, greater maintenance potentially. And then you got more bills and council rates, etc., insurance. Do you think a lot of investors?
But that's how when I sort of said it's going to be roughly 40 grand per scenario one, or roughly that I've factored those
including
in.
all that in.
I guess that's really the cost of ownership as opposed to looking at it as an investment, though, isn't it? I mean, and that's really why most, like you were talking about holding it 20 years. Like, so really it's the fast forward 20 years and making a bet on, well, if you add those 2 $500,000 properties together, am I going to be in the same capital position in a year's time versus a choice of $1 million? There's more diversity in the sense that you've got the ability to sell one of the $500,000 ones at a different time to selling the other one. So you've got flexibility there. But, I guess it's, I look at that sort of scenario and go, well, can I get 2 really cracker assets for $500,000 each, or is that ship gone? Will I be buying really in compromised areas, really low socioeconomic? What are my trade-offs in order to be able to buy 2 versus 1? So I think it's a lot more complicated, and I'd like to have a conversation. It's a lot more complicated and nuanced than just looking at the cash flow of it. Because I know that a lot of investors do.
Absolutely, it is, Veronica. Absolutely, it is. But you don't know what you don't know, right? So can you the 500 grand? No, you couldn't make a good decision with 500 grand today. I'll use 500 grand just so that I wasn't making
an illustration. I get it.
Harder, right?
Yeah.
But what we do know. We were talking earlier about, different regions and different times, different capital cities at different times. I need to keep emphasising, it's got absolutely nothing to do, capital city versus region. Absolutely nothing. That has no bearing whatsoever on risk.
We're good with that. Don't worry.
Nothing at all, right?
We're good with that. We're location agnostic, and we're also population growth agnostic. Like, we're not worried about any of that sort of stuff. But we do I just are interested in your philosophy and approach there. Back to sort of these regions, and you said that there's like 300 that you wouldn't buy in.
Yeah.
What are some of the criteria that would lend it for you to say, well, nah, won't go there? We've already talked about lack of economic diversity or lack of employment diversity.
That's the main thing. That's the main thing,
okay.
Right? So there's lots of. It doesn't mean that they won't grow. Again, everything's grown.
It's relative, though, isn't it?
Well, you look at rate of growth, and I think too often property people focus too much on dollar value change, whereas what we should focus on is percentage value change. So I'll give an example. People do this every Sunday usually because Saturday's the auction day, right? They do this every Sunday without realizing what they're doing. And I'm deliberately going to be using round figures here. But let's say we're reading a story, Domain, realestate.com, whatever, and there's 2 auctions in 2 different cities yesterday, right? And they're talking about the results of the auction. So property number one sold at auction under the hammer yesterday for $1.5 million. And we keep reading the story and we go, oh, the owner paid $1 million for that 10 years ago. Awesome. Made 500 grand. A lot of money. Love it. Happy for them, right? Auction number two. It sold for 800 grand. No, the owner of that coincidentally also owned that property for 10 years. 10 years ago when they bought it, they paid 500 grand for it. Oh, that's not too bad. They made 300 grand. Good on them. Oh, but property number one, yeah, that was a much better investment. It sold for 500 grand. Actually, no. Property number one grew by 50%. Property number two grew by 80%. Yeah. If these were investors and they had $1 million 10 years ago when these properties were purchased, and they bought one property worth $1 million, that's great to make the extra 500 grand. But if they bought two properties that were worth 500 grand and it grew by 80%, they made a lot more money.
And look, that's totally theoretical in terms of those figures, but what you're saying is absolutely correct. And I'm always yelling at the television, yell at the paper for exactly that. It's like, oh, they made a cool whatever, and it's like, oh, did they renovate it? There's all these other costs that would have come out of that as well. And again, the comparison, you're not benchmarking it properly if you're not actually looking at a percentage, and then if you want to break it down an average annualized growth, all that sort of stuff. Totally agreed. Not enough people are properly assessing, the outcomes of these decisions down the track. And I spent a lot of time doing that sort of work and backdate and backtracking things and backtesting things. Now, you talk about, I looked at your website, read a number of your blogs, obviously before we interview you, and there's a lot of celebrating the picks you got right, the predictions that you got right. Tell us about times you got it wrong.
Best learning experiences ever. Name a human being who's never made a decision and reflected on later, oh, I wish I didn't do that. So we've managed to avoid some markets in, say, different times in the last 10 years based on personal experiences with my own money in different times before. They include understanding what is supply. Now, it's not often that an individual location suffers from oversupply. Sydney and Melbourne suffered from that 2017 to 2019. Potentially, if it wasn't for a personal experience a few years before that, potentially we may have invested in Sydney or Melbourne.
But you wouldn't have invested in the type of property that was oversupplied, though, would you? Would you have gone and bought some cookie cutter apartment in Parramatta or Docklands?
We promise you we would not have bought an apartment, no.
No.
But I don't know because we didn't even contemplate buying in Sydney or Melbourne. Why? Because the period of sufferance from a personal experience several years before, our market underperformed significantly. And then when we reflected on why is this happening, pain can be a great teacher, right? Whether it's physical pain, relationship pain, financial pain as a business owner, or property market pain, stock market pain, whatever. It's only a good lesson if you take the time to reflect on why have I got this feeling I don't want it again, right? So two different scenarios here. One was understand the importance of economic diversity. Way back in yonder, bought into market that had some economic diversity, like Perth has got some economic diversity, right? And then a key industry sector has a downturn, and it's like, it took a long time to recover, right? So that is a great way to learn. Not that you would want to do that, but it's a way of, well, how do we define economic diversity? Because we've been there, done that before. And the oversupply situation, they're the two main causes of markets having a downturn. Local economy performs poorly, or the construction sector becomes overzealous. So our personal experience with oversupply, we took the time to understand not only what was causing the market to perform poorly, but is there some information, if we could wind the clock back, is there some information, quality information, not opinion stuff, evidence-based stuff that we could grab and sort of know in advance you should avoid that because there's too much there. And we worked out there is. Yeah, supply is the actions of the construction sector, right? If the three of us were property developers instead of property people, we can buy whatever land we want, but we can't actually build anything on it until we've spent umpteen months and lots of money doing our plans, architectural things, feasibility studies, and then the city council must sign off on that, right? When the city council, this is all over Australia, there are 530 city councils in Australia, no one can build anything without the city council saying approved. And when they approve it, there is then a statistical record we've just approved a project that's got 200 apartments in it or 100, housing land packages or whatever. So one of the many activities that I personally do for Propertyology every single month is a data dump of all of the building approvals for every city council in Australia, and then measure what's in the pipeline against what a normal volume is. So in 2015 and 16, you'll both remember this fondly, Melbourne and Sydney were going gangbusters, right? And all the commentary was overseas migration and no housing supply. And the learnings from that other location, I'm looking at building approval volumes going, holy heck, the number of properties approved for construction in Sydney and Melbourne for the next few years is 3 times what they've ever built. I wouldn't have been looking at that data if it wasn't from the previous period of pain. So, a lesson in some ways I wish I didn't have, but I know that it's had a significant influence on making a lot more really good decisions, as we can all say about different walks of our life.
So I've got to ask you one question regarding, being someone who's looked at the regions and investing for a long time, you've got a lot more experience than, say, some new to industry buyers agents. There's an explosion of great marketing businesses that have entered the buyers agency world over the last couple of years, and they have really got their pitch down pat to attract people to work with them. And it's like anything with you buying, something online, a lot of people are buying through social channels, right? And they a couple of clicks away from speaking to someone, and then all of a sudden they're making major financial decisions, not buying t-shirts. What's your thoughts on these new buyers agents, and particularly some of the mistakes they're making? Because often they're all going to the same place, right? They're all going to Townsville. They're all going, and there's a bit of, because they're so effective at their marketing, they're actually buying quite a lot of volume when they're all buying in the same place, and it's a bit of a confirmation bias and driving prices. And then, so what's your thoughts on the impact they're having in regional investing?
Well, I don't know if they're just doing regions, are they? They're just buyers agents. I guess it depends where they live and, which individual buyers agent we're talking about. There are probably, I know some of the people you're referring to, but there's probably a lot of names people are doing it who I'd never heard of. But I imagine that all of the capital cities, as well as, however many regions, they've got people with a business now as a buyer's agent that wouldn't have been there 3 years, 5 years ago. Some of them might be, only buying in their own hometown, the traditional buyer's agent model. Some might be buying there plus other locations. I just hope that, deep down in their core, they are honest and ethical people, first and foremost. I shared the same concern with you about, the overnight, it seems, Chris, they can get this massive profile, isn't it? That is concerning, because the general public, I used the word curiosity before, people just don't have enough of it. So if someone, is punching out all these posts and videos and talking fast and sounding confident and all that sort of stuff, and you just happen to be in the market, I'm looking to buy an investment property, and this dude just keeps popping up on my feed all the time, he seems to know what he's talking about, bang, they've made a decision. That is a worry. It doesn't mean that person's done anything wrong, but I guess all consumers, not just property, you got to take ownership of your own decisions, right? So if individuals get influenced by that and they engage someone who might be well-meaning and might be honest, but just doesn't have the skill and experience, then I think the owner's got to, the buyer's still got to take responsibility. That's the same as
it's a bit generational, actually. A client had a strategy session with a client the other day, and they've got a 24-year-old son and they're going to help him get into his first property. And of course, he's all over the TikTok, property experts. And so they were questioning me on certain people to help them in certain regional areas. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's really interesting that your son is sort of going, I really want to go with this dude. And it's, they're relating obviously to people of their own age, and we're old farts, and they just think we don't know what we're talking about. So it's just an interesting thing. But I think where Chris is going a little bit more on that question is not so much, we know that it's easier to get a buyer's agent license, sadly. We know there's a lot of new competitors out there who have, some with very little experience, some no experience. And even those with experience, if they haven't been mentored or been able to shadow, really good buyer's agents, they don't know what they don't know, because the licensing program doesn't actually teach them anything about due diligence. or
Yeah.
anything actually to do with the job of being a buyer's agent. But there's property research is becoming a much more crowded space. There's been a lot made of the use of AI in predicting growth markets. And what we see also is some of these larger buyer's agency businesses that are borderless, they're really trading hard on this ability to predict the future, which, we've been around a long time. We know that anyone who's going to try and predict a property market, really, they might get the next year, like if they're a bit lucky. But, odds are they're going to get it wrong. We know that, but there's a lot of fresh blood out there and very good at marketing as well. But also they're using AI and they're like, well, AI is smarter than us old fogies. AI is smarter than all of us put together. You know what I mean? Like we're now turning to AI. I'm curious to know what you make of that.
Of AI?
Well, just the use of it in the property research space. And how that might change things.
Yeah, we should go and have a wine and they won't be able to shut us up. It sounds like we both got the same serious gripe. I've been ranting a lot about AI the last couple of years, in personal conversations. It's doing my head in. Like anything that is artificial can never be better than something is authentic. Whether we're talking artificial flavorings, whether we're talking artificial turf, or whether we're talking artificial intelligence, nothing artificial can beat the best version of the authentic version. We've been talking a lot about property markets and misconceptions, and people really don't understand property markets very well with what is natural, with their own skull. Economists have got no idea about property markets, and they're the profession that's put on the absolute pedestal. And now we're saying, we're going to use technology and we're going to tap in and get the intelligence from the natural version and we're going to put it into a widget and it's going to do it better. Well, if you don't even have the basic fundamentals, if you don't even know as a natural human that demand is not population growth and supply is not new construction, if you don't even know that, how the hell can a machine know it? Like, what hope have they got? Like, anyone who thinks that because you've got a technology background you can write an algorithm, or because you like mathematics that you can create a formula for a property market, if that was true, believe me, I would have worked that out many, many years ago because I would have saved millions of my own hours if that was possible. It's not possible because many of the most important variables, and if the listeners reflect on what we've been talking about, many of the most important variables are not expressed numerically. They're not. So we talk about economic growth is the secret source for housing demand. Economic growth is not measured in a spreadsheet. Economic growth is not an unemployment rate. Economic growth is a big bunch of decisions, federal government, state government, city councils, existing businesses, new businesses. That's expressed in written text. So most of my time every day is spent reading all those texts, different reports, and then sort of going, that's going to 10 jobs. Who cares? That's 50 jobs. Oh, that's okay. Like AI can't pick it up. It is a worry. What it will do is people will become really good at using the marketing that Chris was talking about and say, I'm better than everyone else because I've developed the latest widget that's going to make you the smartest cookie. And so people will engage that person thinking they've got the smartest cookie, but only time will reveal that this is a useless piece of cardboard. It's not a cookie at all.
So I think that, AI used well could be an amazingly powerful tool, but you need some domain authority or domain experience and knowledge to be able to work out whether what the AI is suggesting perhaps is...
I think AI has a role, not just in property, for improving efficiencies.
Yeah.
Something that you or I could do manually, but then a machine can do it, in half the time. That's great use of AI. Anything, not just in property, anything that involves society using their brain less and relying on a widget. Our brain is no different to our hamstring or our heart. The less you use it and the poorer you treat it, the less effective it will become.
I know, I'm not as good a parker ever since they invented those beeper things. But listen, do you see the potential, though, for some markets to experience unnatural price movements due to volumes of investors being influenced by these researchers?
What do you mean by unnatural? How do you find unnatural?
Well, if we look at, the basic drivers of a market are economic conditions, right? So if they're going up, the market goes up, they go down, the market goes down. But if you've got more people engaging the services of buyers agents who are utilising data rightly or wrongly, and they point to markets that don't necessarily have those fundamentals for long-term performance or sustainable performance, but they are driving, numbers of people to go into a certain market. That's why I call it an unnatural price movement, because that's actually then driven by an external force that is got nothing to do with the economy of that region. Like they've just decided because of, they might all use the same metrics and all the metrics point to something, then they go and actually effectively make it happen.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering because, like, for example, I've talked to a lot of buyers agents in Melbourne at the moment. Now, you're saying Melbourne, it's got a long while before the economically it's going to move through the phase that it's in, right? And that economists are saying that, you're saying that. However, a lot of the contrarian buyers agents are going, oh, Melbourne's a place to get into.
Yeah,
and the
great
buyers
example.
agents that I know that are on the ground there are going, I cannot believe the amount of these borderless buyers agents that are now buying in Melbourne, right?
Yeah.
So they're ignoring, the economics of it. They're ignoring all the typical signs you'd be looking at. They're just being contrarian, thinking, oh, well, it's got to take off again soon, so I want to get in first, right? And then effectively that'll make that happen, right?
Yeah.
But that's an unnatural price movement because that's actually the opinion of so-called experts who have a large market share.
I would say that there's actually no expertise there, because if there was genuine expertise, they wouldn't be buying there. And I don't say that with any pleasure, because I love Melbourne, and I want anyone who owns property, whether it's in bloody Melbourne or Mount Isa, I want them to have a good experience. But it's important.
That's one example. I mean, there are other regional towns that I know, or regional centres. Yeah,
it's a good question. So I guess what you're talking there about is it's more sentiment. So. You can have locations that have, for whatever reason, more than normal hype and, lots of people want to buy. It'd have to be like an enormous volume of transactions that wouldn't ordinarily happen from just people like you're talking about in the Melbourne scenario.
That's in Melbourne, yeah. But like in a regional centre that might only sell, maybe there's only, 200 transactions in a given year, and all of a sudden you've got buyers agents buying there, and maybe they buy 20 or 30. That's a significant percentage, yeah.
Yeah. So what you're talking about there is if it was that location, the hypothetical one, Veronica, that's got 200 transactions in a typical year, it's got a population of 5,000 people. Because that's the numbers. That's the number of transactions. Like, so, even a unintelligent person, even an unintelligent person who thinks that they're intelligent and understand property markets, I can't imagine like a whole heap of them saying, here's this location that's got 5,000 people and it's a bloody good decision, and I'm going to start my reputation online and we're going to buy a heap of properties there. If they did do it, would that have a big impact on that property market? Absolutely. If you're only normally 200 transactions and then 10 buyers agents buy 50 between them, that's a big influence. I'd never known that to happen in any location in Australia. Doesn't mean it couldn't, but I can't think of a scenario where it's happened. I reckon the Melbourne scenario takes me back to so my hometown's in Brisbane. What's happening in Melbourne now is reflective of what happened in Brisbane in 2014. So 2014, Sydney and Melbourne were going nuts. A couple of regions were doing well, not many. Brisbane was dead flat. Our phone was ringing off the hook every day, mostly from people living in Sydney and Melbourne saying, hey, we've got this equity. Well, can you help us invest in Brisbane? Well, you're interested in my business? Sure, I'm interested in that. Explain their point of difference, and then said to them, if you engage with services, we won't be helping you invest in Brisbane. But why? It's the next hotspot. Well, if anyone wants Brisbane to do well, it's me, mate. I live here. I'll go home here. I've got investment property here. But acting on a confirmation bias isn't going to make a move. But the fundamentals will determine how it performs. I don't determine that. You don't determine that. But so what I was saying to them is the same thing I'm saying to people about Melbourne now. The economic conditions of Brisbane right here, right now in 2015 are weak for these reasons. You can buy here, but I won't be taking a fee to help you do that because I've got no confidence at all that in 3, 4, 5 years' time, you're going to be saying that was the best decision. Like, hey, not even remotely close. Oh, but why is that? This is what they were saying to me every single day for a couple of years. Oh, because everyone's saying Brisbane's the next hotspot. So I was sort of humouring them, and I was going, okay, enlighten me. So why is Brisbane the next hotspot? Well, because Sydney and Melbourne are burned. Yeah, but what the hell's that got to do with Brisbane? Mm-hmm. Well, because Brisbane's the next biggest city. Yeah, but what's that got to do with Brisbane? Nothing. It's like saying what is Parramatta's performance as a footy team you compare to Melbourne Storm? Like, the inputs are two completely different things, right? The economy, the outlook for the economy, if it's not good, it doesn't mean the market won't produce growth, but relative to whatever the best performing markets will be in the future, it will be disappointing. So when will Melbourne's market perform well? It doesn't mean it won't grow this year. Because if there's 4 or 5 interest rate cuts, rising tides will lift all ships, including Melbourne, right? But relative to the rest of Australia, Melbourne's property market will not start to get back to even towards the middle of the pack, let alone be a star performer, until its local economy sorts its shit out. And it's pretty hard to do that when you've got this massive debt and you can't afford to invest in infrastructure and people are leaving the city. It's sad, unfortunately, but that's not what people who live in Melbourne want to hear, but that's the brutal truth.
So we were going to ask you for a property dumbo to wrap the episode up. It sounds like you probably just gave it to us.
I'll give you a different one.
Go on.
Go.
So I bought a property. I'll pick on myself rather than embarrass the client.
We love that.
Pick on myself. So I bought a property. This is way before I was doing what I'm doing as a professional. I was a DIY and I was absolutely adamant that I had Colonel Sanders' secret herbs and spices. I didn't venture too far, but I tried a little bit. I went 100 kilometres up the road to my hometown in a place called Caloundra on the Sunshine Coast. And I was adamant that the secret source for property price growth was water. Because I feel very comfortable holidaying near the water and that sort of stuff, right? Great example of bias and emotion. Never do that again, Simon. So what happened? First 2 years. So I've got this apartment that was literally on the Esplanade, cannot be built out ever. And the first 2 years, I think it had about 30% growth or something, Veronica. So what am I doing? Beating my chest, I'm a hero, got the Colonel Sanders secret herbs and spices. Next 2 years, lost the 30% growth. What did I do? Not throw the toys out of the cot. I was confused. I was absolutely confused. But what I said was, Simon, note to self, water does not make property prices grow because that beautiful ocean is still there and I've lost 30%. It took me some years to realise that what actually caused the 30% to decline was what I've been talking about, mate, economic growth. What was the Sunshine Coast economy doing then? In the toilet.
Yep, there you go. And, you know, the water is only relative. It just makes you pay more compared to an apartment without the view, right?
And makes you feel good.
Very nice
Don't
to look
invest
at.
on feelings.
Well, thank you very much for your time
Simon.
today, Simon. It's been a great chat.
My pleasure.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.